Right now, the government is already spending about 500 billion a year on interest payments. That's up from about 300 billion. In fact, I was watching a conversation on CNBC and they were actually talking about this, and they said that at the rate things are moving, it's possible that in 10 years we might be paying $1 trillion dollars a year in interest on the national debt. 10 years, we could be paying $1 trillion dollars in interest in 1 year. How are these guys getting 10 years? We've got a $31 trillion dollars national debt. 4% of that is 1.25 trillion. And, the average maturity, I think, is under 5 years. A third of the debt matures in the next year, but the debt is going up. 5 years from now, the national debt will be over 40 trillion. And we're going to have to pay an interest rate probably more than 5% on that. So $1 trillion tab for interest on the national debt isn't a decade away. It's a year, maybe two away. That's how close this crisis is. Where is the government going to get that money? It's probably going to be something like 30% of tax revenue or 40% of tax revenue would be going just for interest on the national debt, not paying down any of the debt, just paying the interest on the debt, and the debt keeps growing. This is a massive fiscal time bomb. In fact, earlier today, I retweeted a tweet that I made back on September 28th of 2021, and I was referring to a comment that Janet Yellen made in response to a question at one of these hearings about the national debt and if we should be worried about the size of the debt. And her answer was no. She said we shouldn't be worrying about the size of the national debt. She said instead, we should be focusing on how low interest rates are and how low the current debt service is on that debt. So it didn't matter that we had a lot of debt because it was cheap to finance it. Now, at that time, I pointed out, hey, wait a minute. What happens when interest rates go up? I compared that to people who were buying houses with adjustable rate mortgages. What happens when the rate goes up and you can't afford it? Because the Treasury wasn't taking advantage of low 30-year borrowing costs. The Fed was borrowing for 6 months, for 1 year, for 2 years. So they were rolling the dice and gambling that interest rates stayed low. Well, they're not low. They're much higher. I wonder if Janet Yellen is worrying about the national debt now that interest rates have moved up so much. Or is she going to start worrying because we already know that they're going to move much higher? For years, that was the justification that the government gave for borrowing money. They kept saying, hey, interest rates are really low. We should take advantage of it. We should just keep borrowing money while rates are low. Well, maybe you could have made that argument if you were locking in those low rates for 30 years, not if you were having to roll them over 30 days, 90 days, 1 year. And in fact, I often said, wait a minute, just because something is cheap doesn't mean you should do it. I would say, hey, if heroin was free, if they were giving out free heroin, would you say, hey, heroin is free, I might as well use it, it's free? If something is bad, just because the cost goes down, that doesn't mean you do it. And taking on all this debt was bad. Just because it was temporarily cheap, it wasn't a reason to do it. Well, we did it, and now we have to deal with the consequences. Powell said it himself. The longer you wait to deal with a problem, the worse the consequences. Well, we've waited a long time. In fact, the Federal Reserve deliberately created inflation since 2008 to postpone the pain. Why did we do quantitative easing? Why did interest rates go way down? Because the Fed did not want to allow a bad recession or allow a bad recession to get worse. The Fed wanted to prop up stock prices. The Fed wanted to prop up real estate prices. So in order to do that, we created inflation. We put interest rates at zero. We did quantitative easing. Well, now we've got a huge inflation problem, and now the Fed has to fight a monster that it created, but the Fed can't fight and create inflation at the same time.